Well, things are constantly changing, and it gave me a sense of not knowing where I was or where I was going. Not being in a firm, known spot is part of is an idea now in the air.
Chaos is such a misunderstood word. You see, for many people, chaos means disorder. Curiously, chaos, as studied in modern science, and many people speak of the new science of chaos, chaos is a type of order. It's a type of unstable order in which the temporal sequences are very complex.
The postmodern mind is a mind that has no comprehensive view of reality, and it is taking its cue from science, which has no imageable view of the way nature happens.
The conversation is about the fact of the reality of the society as we see it now on the table, presented by people who are quite capable. We have people who risk madness by trying to make themselves good people. We have people who risk imprisonment by making deals that are not to be made. We are taking artists who risk madness as well by making and objectifying time.
Can we sail the sea of life without a compass and still reach compassion? During 15 years of teaching religion and philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Huston Smith's hypothesis was thoroughly tested. An epistemology that aims relentlessly at control rules out the possibility of transcendence.
Ça dépend de la condition initiale, évidemment. Bien sûr. Mais on peut donc étudier quelle est la partie.
Biologist Ilya Prigogine is sometimes referred to as the poet of thermodynamics. He works at the borderline of living and non-living matter, exploring irreversible non-linear processes, which radically changes our view on space and time. Avant-garde composer and artist John Cage made the silence between notes an essential element of music.
27.
Following his growing interest in Eastern philosophies, he became acquainted with Zen Buddhism and the Book of Changes, integrating the element of chance into his work.
So much has changed. I mean to say, changed in this century from the previous century. Many people still have the ideas of the last century which they've memorized, and not thinking about them, they state them, but when they do, they don't fit our present circumstances. But now, now we have a different attitude, which comes from these reflections and transparencies and so forth. We realize that each instant is unique, so that we don't have the time to go to those 19th century depths. We have to be in the immediacy of the present moment.
One object which is found since 5,000 years before Christ is this strange object which has this round cylindrical form embedded in a square. And this seems to be the first representation which we find of space-time. Because time is circular. Time has no beginning, has no end, like the motion of the sun, the rising periodically. And that is an idea which is found in many civilizations, that time is represented by a circle. And the square are the four directions of space: north, south, east, west. And therefore, it is time crossing space. Now, time crossing space is obviously space-time.
The new physics, it has given us not yet a different metaphor for reality, but none. Reality in nature itself has become so strange that the technical word, it is counterintuitive. We can no longer imagine what nature is like. We can say that modern science showed us that our senses are false witnesses. My senses tell me this arm of the chair is solid. No, there's vastly more space than matter here. My senses tell me that it's static. Wrong again. Science said it's actually a hive of activity in which electrons are circling nuclei 1 billion times a second, something like that. But postmodern science, or the quantum mechanic, is saying something more disturbing. It's saying not only are our senses false witnesses, but our imagination is a false instrument in the sense that it cannot conform to the way, cannot image the way in which nature actually is. Matter that is both wave and particle, we can't imagine that.
There was a conflict between, on one side, the physicist who said time is an illusion. On the other hand, the philosophers, or everybody, I mean just any human being, for whom time is a fundamental dimension, the basic existential dimension. And this is a question which people have asked since the start of rational thought. Now, in modern quantum mechanics, based on Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Dirac, and so on, the basic equation presents a law. There are no events on the basic level. In the orthodox Copenhagen interpretation, we are creating the events by measuring something. So we come again to the idea that we are perturbing a timeless universe. And that is something which is very difficult to believe for me. And that is the reason why I have developed recently a theory in which the events are due to the instability of the dynamics itself and not to the measuring process which introduces a subjectivistic element into the theory.
Art may be the last place that anyone has to exercise their act of discovery. So for that reason, I don't have to say anything as to what my work means, because I wouldn't want to interrupt that act of discovery.
Ilya Prigogine, then, what do you most bring with you that you want people to know now, straight away, before our discussion?
Well, one of the reasons why I accepted this invitation is the feeling that there is in general, a misconception about science, and especially about the present role of science. Science in the last decades is entering a new period. We are living a kind of second Copernican revolution. And most of the criticism which I heard, even during these movies, about science is directed to a science which is no more our science. I would like to say that an equally important contribution is coming from what's called non-equilibrium or classical mechanics, because this has led to the rediscovery of time. And time is really, as Eddington once wrote, the bridging point between spirituality and matter.
More than on anything else, the future of civilization depends on how the two most powerful forces in history, namely science on the one hand and religion on the other, how these two most powerful forces in history settle into relationship with each other. I think they have been in a very poor relationship, inadequate, ill-conceived relationship for a number of centuries now.
I would not oppose science and religion. I feel this is a little in the past, I would say. I consider personally, first of all, that Western science has as origin a theology. It's just opposite from what people believe. Western science was created in the 17th century and was spelled out very clearly by Leibniz. In Leibniz's views, essentially, science had to bring men closer to the knowledge of God. The idea was that for God, there is no difference between past, future, present, everything is there, eternally, and therefore the scientist had to eliminate time. That is the reason why time was excluded, I would say, from classical science, basic science. Therefore, after having excluded time, essentially science became a kind of mechanism, and there was a kind of opposition. Do we still need this godlike behavior, or can we simply do with a universe which is a kind of automaton? And what Joseph Needham, my friend Joseph Needham, mentioned always is what he calls the Western schizophrenia, which he says is oscillating between a bird as an automaton or a bird ruled by a theology. And we are all astonished. We are astonished by this world, which is so, I would say, rich, so varied, so different from this automaton which classical science had imagined. And this is, of course, one of the, I would say, driving force in creating a new utopia, a new dialogue with nature. But I would not like to call it necessarily a religion. I would like to call it more community with the universe, belonging, having an interaction with the universe, feeling that we have not to think about the universe as our property, but to feel how we are emerging out of this universe. At some points in the history of religion, you had religions which were centered outside the universe. And at some point, we have religions which are more, I would say, the universe as a whole, more pantheistic views.
The Australian Aborigines, the American Indians, all traditional cultures hold that the world is basically a spiritual habitat, that it is infused with spirit, that it emanates from a source that is wondrous, mysterious, greater than we are, and by rub-off from this origin, the world itself is, Max Weber used the phrase, an enchanted garden. And every little stone, leaf, reflects the glory, one might say, of the great spirit or the ultimate mystery.
Rousseau said, all nature is a harmony. That always seemed to me a dubious proposition. Are we now of the opinion that nature is not a harmony?
No, there's a harmony in chaos.
Chaos is such a misunderstood word. You see, for many people, chaos means disorder. Curiously, chaos, as studied in modern science, and many people speak of the new science of chaos, chaos is a type of order. It's a type of unstable order in which the temporal sequences are very complex. You see, our classical idea was that molecules are colliding at random, you know, like dust particles. How would they then produce coherence? And now we see that non-equilibrium can produce coherence, can produce structures, can produce very complex patterns, and which permit us to see, to understand, I would say, much better the type of structures which we see in the world around us.
You need more anarchy in your terms, you see. You need more various activities, more multiple views.
There are many more that can be, many more answers, and each one of us can perhaps discover his own answer. It won't be a single answer. There's no longer a mainstream in art. There are 1,000 ways to go, or not 1,000, it's just too small a number. I think we have a great difference from one person to another. And we don't all have the same experience. And it's through Duchamp that we know that it's the observer or the person who pays attention who finishes the work of art. So nothing is done until each one of us does it. And then it's done in a very unique way.
The metaphor of the view of the world which we have today is art. Is art in the sense that it is something which contains both laws and events. Like we see now in nonlinear systems, we come to breaking points, we have new possibilities. Before we come to the breaking points, it's more or less deterministic. When we are at the breaking points, we have many choices.
The other thing that's happening is the greater quantity, not only of people, but of things, and particularly of information. And in the presence of that complexity, my use of chance operations is very useful. And I think that that's generally known in computer technology. I mean to say that many programs are based on the use of chance operations. Things are changing. I'm trying to write without relation to time now. I mean my music. It's very curious because in all my life there have been time structures, time brackets, clocks, and now they're all going.
This mixture of laws and events is typical, of course, of art. That is the reason why I cannot agree with what John Cage has said, by the way, in the sense that the main point is to return to chance. Chance is an essential element of nature, but it's not the only one. Nature is this curious mixture of events, determinism, and laws.
I think you'll find that if you look at this picture again, you'll see that he made decisions.
Yes, but he wants to have a music which would be timeless. For example, when he makes the sound separated by silences which are long, that will make a music which we have no direction of time, which could be played in the same way in one direction as in the other.
Another thing that Duchamp taught us, when asked what he did, he said, I breathe. It's not a question of learning. It's a question of doing your experience.
The main lesson I would take of modern science is that we are not alone. We can communicate. We can really see something completely new appearing. You see, Kant was thinking that in a sense we impose our view on nature, that we put nature to question. But recent developments over the last, I would say starting with the whole century, have proved the contrary. In a sense, we started with the idea of matter being permanent, without structure, and we come to the idea that matter is a fossil which is a remembrance of the beginning of the universe. So that protons are the testimony, in a sense, of what happens 15 billion years ago. We started with the idea that the universe can have no history. Giordano Bruno said it. How can the universe have history? The universe is everything. It contains all possible histories. And we came to the idea that the universe has a history. There is not a single idea which we accepted, more or less, in the 19th century, which is still there today. Now, of course, there is no end to this. There will be no solution of this. And therefore, let's dream. Let's have everybody's own solution. I had always the impression that one of the main purposes of this type of Indian sculpture was to try to reconcile the opposites, to go beyond the contradictions. And here the problem is a contradiction between the eternity and time, between the absolute and the relative. As well known, this is Vishnu, who is sleeping. His wife keeps him alive. He's sleeping on the snake, which separates the world of eternity from the world of activity of man. And from his navel, there is Brahma arising, and Brahma is the active principle of the world. And therefore the world, in a sense, is a realization of the dream of Vishnu. And when Vishnu will wake up, then this world will be destroyed, and another world will start, and another realization of the universe will start. So it is, in a sense, like to say that the reality is the dream of the absolute. To call the unknown and perhaps the unknowable God or not is finally for me a matter of secondary importance. What is really important is to feel not alienated in this universe.
Who was it said yesterday that we must think of the whole thing as one household? I mean, is that it? Is it a household that we look after, the human race?
Complicated.
Sir, I'm asking you, yes.
I've lost the issue. I don't know what the issue is. If you're saying, is the issue looking after the universe?
Looking after, first of all, the people and their environment.
Oh, that's
I think the universe is taking care of itself. I mean, besides, it's an awful, I mean, we're in the universe. I mean, we're on a spaceship. I mean, there's no need to take another spaceship and go someplace else and screw that up, too. I mean, why don't you just stay here and take care of your garden?
But it is true that we now have the power, and we've been using it unwittingly for some time, to despoil
You have
the
power,
universe.
but you don't have administration.
Say that again?
I mean, sure, they have power, but there's no administration.
That's true.
If that were true, everybody would have food, clothing, and shelter.
But is that required?
The only thing we have now in common is digestive system.
The fact that some dimensions of the world are becoming global indeed implies increased role of nonlinearities. Something which sounds a little esoteric is that all social behavior is nonlinear. In other words, what everybody is doing has influences other people. You have collective action. Now, nonlinearities lead to instabilities, to fluctuations. The way in which the stock market in Tokyo responds has an influence on what happens in the stock market of New York. And therefore, this global dimension is also a dimension of greater uncertainty, of greater risk.
We could begin with a credit system in which everyone who is alive is given credit. The moment I say that, I'm sure most people would say, but that's impossible. But to move in that direction, and to think of money not as not as paper, but as numbers that can as well be one number as another. All we really want is that people can live together on the earth and each one do what he needs to do. It sounds like a simple problem, but we've turned it into something very complicated. And even if say I make a plan which is foolproof, then the newspapers will tell me the next morning that the fools are in power and that it's quite impossible.
The manager of today is the student of the 60s. And I remember the economist John Galbraith, Theodore Roszak, The Making of a Counterculture, Koser, Alinsky, in France, Jean-Paul Sartre, in art, the musical Hair, Aquarius, and I got children, and we got children, and we worked very hard in our no-nonsense period. But at the end of the 60s, we believed also in a turning point of civilization, or our utopia. And we changed from rebels to no-nonsense workers.
It's very interesting that you quote the 60s, because the 60s are also the time when I have been more in contact with French students, and I don't know so much the evolution of the American students, but the French students were very much divided about various types of ideologies. You know, our generation, the generation which preceded me and followed me, was very upset about all kinds of things. We had the problem of Algeria in France, we had the problem of Mao, how to judge Mao, a lot of problems about, I would say, social utopias. To some extent, I think the situation has changed. The situation has changed, and curiously, I would say it has changed not through a new political ideology, because I think the political ideology is still to come, but it has to some extent changed because of the internal change in technology, in science, in our outlook, especially, of course, of communication science. I think it has become obvious that we have to look for a new global identity. I mean, because we are participating in so many things. But I have this feeling, by speaking with young people, by hearing what they say and so on, that there is a feeling of relation with nature, of necessity of solidarity with other civilizations and so on, which is growing between young people. It's no more so much, I would say, introspection. You know, you quoted Sartre. Sartre was an enemy of science. Sartre was thinking that the main problem was men looking on men. In other words, it was a kind of closed universe. Personally, it seems to me, now I give a personal point of view, it is what we learn is that we cannot have this fragmented view. We cannot speak about literature for literature, art for art, science for science. We have to take a more global view.
I think it has, as I said earlier, I think it has to do with our very real sense of larger numbers of people, and our very real sense of the earth as a single place rather than separate places, and the fantastic changes in technology. Sheer magic. which we now expect. We take for granted the experience before we have it. I mean, when it comes, it seems perfectly normal. If instead of 2 dimensions from the fax machine you got 3, you wouldn't be surprised. But the water tends to be something you have to work on in order to have it be good, so that you can't any longer turn on the tap and drink the water. You have to go to lengths of your own devising, almost, in order to drink a glass of water. The air is not good to breathe. At the same time that we're in the presence of technological magic. It's very strange. And those paradoxes, which are not for the mind, but are paradoxes in daily life, perhaps give rise to an art that has no place, doesn't give you any place to rest.
It's a pity John Cage isn't here. When he said the future isn't here yet, I would like to ask him, would you like it to be a child again? But now I've changed my question somewhat. And what's the birth of a child nowadays? Is it a reproduction of labor, or more increase the ecological disaster? Is it an act of creation, or is it maybe just an example, an expression of time?
Well, it is labor.
Eh? Sorry, you characterize it.
Yes, it's, as a matter of fact, it's unskilled labor.
And? No more?
Oh, should there be more? You ask for a lot, don't you?
Dr. Christians, no, would you dissuade people from adding to the population?
I think the population, you know, this morning it was already an indication that we have now 5 billion people and we will have 10 billion people. And in my feeling, that will create, and that makes necessary to look for a complete new understanding for togetherness. For togetherness, that means what kind of behavior, what role will play technology, what role will play science, and what role will play the economy and the management of the economy. In other words, that must be an integrated formula.
Dr. Christians, I'd like to say that all of these questions that are coming up, from the question to management application to what essentially is supposed to be grasped, to whether or not one should bring a child into the world, can't be answered by the majority of the panel as it's being presented. With all the goodwill, with all the good intentions, and with all the hard work that all of these people put into, they're still talking about Mrs. Beaton's cookbook. They're still talking about placing it within the context, which is why art is obviously not fitting into this conference, in the context of a house that you all know what it looks like. It's motifati culture. You know exactly what the house these good intentions will give warmth in. You know exactly what the structure is. Everything that's been done in science in the last 25 years has just been turned into a means to propagate furnishing this same house. But the meaning of the work of the 2 scientists that have presented is that this structure no longer is capable of housing a conference. It's no longer capable of housing anything. It is essentially a motifati culture. It becomes, in speaking about how we will deal with the aspirations of the third world, as a Kinderküche in Kirche mentality. We cannot have this and come up with any feasible answer to this gentleman about what shall we do about having children. Nobody can question Deutsche Langweiligkeit. That's not to be questioned, because that's motifati culture again. Nobody can question the reasons for the misuse of drugs, the reasons for that. They are not sociological reasons. They are reasons that this house has become stifling. They're like a museum. Nobody opens the window for fear of giving mommy a cold. And until that is straightened out, there is no conceivable way to answer any of these questions. You can tell somebody how to make more money. That's not going to help. The conversation is about the fact of the reality of the society as we see it now on the table, presented by people who are quite capable. We have people who risk madness by trying to make themselves good people. We have people who risk imprisonment by making deals that are not to be made. We are taking artists who risk madness as well by making and objectifying time. All art that you see is just a means for artists to have something to sell, to buy the time, to spend their time devoted to something the major society considers purposeless. It's the only reason for the art object.
I really agree with you, you know, when people have to think better of the kind of questions they ask. But since they come here, they want to hear some wisdom from people. Maybe not real wisdom, but just simple banalities, but that can open their minds to what more or less everybody knows.
Could you, John, continue where Lawrence stopped? Because
well, my only thought on it was while we're talking about unique children and what a great thing they are, since this time yesterday, 40,000 of them died. And by the time this gets to be tomorrow, at this time, 40,000 more will die of various preventable ailments and famine. You have to drop the idea of a utopia, actually.
We haven't got to utopia yet.
No, I know, and you never should. It's a straight line. Not everybody wants to get a classical education either.
No.
And a lot of people just want to take drugs and hang out on the corner. A great number of people want to do that.
I think that we tend to behave better when we think well of ourselves. I think that science in the last 3 centuries has reduced our self-esteem. Every man and woman senses what the mystics called the ground of our being, something that is greater within us than our finite selves. When this ultimate component in our being breathes through our intellect, it is genius. When it breathes through our will, it is virtue. And when it flows through our hearts, it is love. It is real. It is not nostalgia. If we have lost the power to sense it, that is a brutality that somehow modernity has inflicted on us. In Christian terminology, he who seeketh his or her life in egoistic grasping loses it, and those who can step out of their own light and cease to identify themselves simply with their private interests, they find life. One of the most appalling things is the savings and loan scandal, where I've heard the estimates $50 million diverted by wise people who knew the economy and channeled it off into their own pockets. And chemical companies selling biological weapons to Iraq, knowing that that's where it was going to. You know, we are a flawed species.
There, I do wish that we can find a way to have less presence of power and less presence of wealth and the differences of wealth and poverty. And I hope that instead of government, that we could have intelligence, and for the whole world rather than one nation. But when I say that, it seems, in relation to the daily newspaper, for instance, it seems unlikely.
The question that is in my mind is whether the artist in our century has felt cramped by the materialistic, I won't even say scientific, I will say scientistic view of the 20th century. My empathies are with the artists. What are they going to do with the human spirit in a cramped view of reality? It's a very difficult position to be in.
By the so-called wisdom trip, as you place the constant placation of previous aesthetics, the constantly trying to reuse, misuse, or otherwise aesthetics that no longer function within the world as we now see it, you're alienating the artist far more than you would be doing if you would at least take the trouble to see that the artist initially is the same as every other human being. And the function of art is not to be creative. It's not to bring forth into the world things that do not exist. It's a normal, viable, reasonable occupation. And since it has existed since the inception of time, there is no question that what you're saying, in fact, although you mean to do other, you're imposing the same muti fati cultura back on us that says that the artist is apart from society, and the artist is only a viable member of society when they don't make art, when they do something else, when they're kind to the children, when they plant trees. I'd like to ask you where this wisdom trip that changes rabbinical sayings into Christian paradigms came about. Where is the validity in this? Where will this lead us, this so-called creativity, when perhaps the alienation that you're so frightened of, the alienation that you detest, is just the ineffable attempt of a part of an organism to leave itself from a diseased part of itself? And that's maybe what you're seeing as the bohemianism and as the aesthetic rebellion of artists. That is not creativity, that's just self-survival. The artist is not there to make you feel better because your social system and your belief pattern doesn't work.
The classical concept of society is in a deep crisis, and it's interesting that science also is in a deep crisis. New ideas are evolving, much more important, I would say, than the discovery of a new elementary particle or something like that, in the sense that the classical science is leaving its old ideological niche, having more, I would say, universal meaning, carrying a more universal message, in which questions which have been asked by other civilizations, like Indian or Chinese civilization, can be incorporated. And this opens the possibility of a new view of the world, which is going beyond the classical subdivisions. Time appears always as a result of an incomplete description. In other words, we now see a much more coherent universe in which all degrees of freedom of the universe are in some way connected. And therefore we have flows of information which are going on there and which are expanding, encompassing more and more degrees of freedom. I cannot go into the mathematics of this, but I want to say it's a little like a universe of communication, that flowing out of information is not the same as recollecting information. The two directions of times flowing from few degrees of freedom to many, or recollecting from many and trying to go back to few, becomes quite different processes. And that is already the end of the mechanistic representation, because in the mechanistic representation, to go from a point A to a point B is the same as to go from B to A. That's true for the interaction between the moon and the earth, because the moon is only speaking to the earth, if I can say so, and the earth speaks to the moon. But in the real world, there are so many degrees of freedom which are involved. It's like a multi-actor society. It is something where there's no unique chief who determines what everybody should think. And this type of universe is a universe with irreversibility in the broken time symmetry. So that is one aspect, is how to describe a universe in which we can never follow all the correlations, in which we cannot. We have to give up the idea of omniscience. And that is, of course, related to an enlargement of rationality. The classical rationality was a dream about complete knowledge. Now we have to accept that we are not seeing the world as perhaps God may see it. We have to see the world as being embedded in the world which we are describing. And that leads to what Herbert Simon has called bounded rationality. Mm-hmm. Bounded rationality in which we have to take into account our own embedding in the world which we describe. So I would say this leads to new problems, new very fundamental problems in science. There's a science of the incomplete, a science of what we know only to some extent. You know, we are like in front of the ocean. Our forerunners were very naive. They would say, well, the ocean is maybe perhaps very deep, but we shall be able to explore the whole ocean. Now we know we shall explore some layer of the ocean. But we cannot say that this layer means that the ocean can be replaced by the layer. There is still the ocean. So we have to give a good theory of the layer floating on the ocean, which is not the same as to have a universe which would be related, only related to this layer.
So our minds change with regard to the answers to our questions. And we discover that all of the answers are good, rather than there being only one good one and all the rest of them wrong, which was, of course, an old 19th century idea.